It begins with a voice, not a voice remembered through the safety of years but one recalled as though it is still echoing in the present, a voice trembling raw and soaked in the fear of a man who swore he had witnessed something no living soul should ever claim to see. The testimony was simple but its weight was unbearable. He said he had seen a death, not just any death but the precise and pitiful ending of a young woman he could describe in intimate detail, her features, her clothes, the very sound of her final breath. But there was something profoundly wrong with this claim, because as the records of the town make clear, this woman was not yet alive, she had not been born, her parents had not yet met, and still he described her end as though he had been there, as though he had stood beside her in her final moment. The opening moments of his account feel less like a memory and more like a haunting. In a darkened room he muttered of candlelight that flickered over pale skin, of a hand reaching out for help that never came, of silence swallowing sound in the middle of a nameless night. Villagers who heard him speak of this vision later swore that his words seemed to carry the weight of inevitability, as though he was not recounting imagination but fact, and yet there could be no fact in it. He was speaking of an event that could not yet exist. It is here at this impossible contradiction that our story begins. In the late 19th century, Europe and America alike were shifting in strange directions. Industrial power was rising, science, medicine and rationalism promised answers for questions that had once belonged to superstition. Yet in towns that lingered on the edges of progress, places steeped in folk memory and religious fear, there was always space for something that could not be explained. And in one such village a man became both witness and prisoner to an experience no one could rationalize. He was not a prophet, he was not celebrated, he did not stand on street corners to gather believers. He was in most ways painfully ordinary, a man of limited means, a tradesman whose name barely appears in the parish documents of the time, and yet it was through him that the impossible was spoken aloud. The words slipped from him not as a sermon but as a confession, as though he himself was horrified by what had entered his mind. Some said he had dreamt it, others whispered that he had been touched by madness, but those who heard him closely, those who dared not laugh at his trembling hands, admitted that his description carried something different, an authenticity that was unnerving precisely because it felt too vivid to be dismissed. He did not speak like a storyteller weaving fancies, he spoke like a man traumatized, struggling to put words to something he wished he could forget. When he described the woman he gave her a face that no one recognized. He spoke of her hair long and dark, he spoke of the faint mark upon her temple like a bruise pressed into the skin from birth. He spoke of her dress, pale fabric torn near the hem, and of a night filled with silence before a sudden collapse. But no such woman lived in the town, no family could claim her, no neighbor recalled her, she belonged to no one. And so the man's words seemed absurd until the suggestion of impossibility crept in, for if she did not exist now, did that mean she was yet to exist? Was his vision not a reflection of memory but a fracture in time itself, giving him sight of what had not yet happened? This idea frightened the villagers more than the description of death itself. A death can be mourned, a vision can be prayed away, but a knowledge of the future that was something the church warned against, something forbidden, something that blurred the line between the human and the divine. The man, perhaps sensing the danger of what he carried, did not shout of his visions from rooftops, he whispered them to a neighbor after a night of restless dreams, to a fellow worker when fatigue bent his back, to his family though even they grew cold with unease. His life, already small, became smaller as the burden of knowledge drew suspicion instead of sympathy. Yet one detail cannot be ignored. Every time he spoke of the vision, the description remained unchanged, the details never shifted, never softened, never contradicted themselves. This was not the fluid story of imagination, it was fixed, frozen, as though he were describing a painting etched in his mind. That consistency would later haunt those who remembered it, for consistency suggests truth, and truth suggests inevitability. In the years that followed, fragments of his testimony were preserved in journals and parish notes, not as central records but as troubling asides. Villagers who tried to write down what they had heard often did so with hesitance, leaving out names, disguising the subject as though even recording it might give the prophecy weight. But enough pieces remained to suggest that his claim was real, and that those who heard it did not easily forget. Imagine the atmosphere in which his words first spread: narrow cobblestone streets, the air damp with the scent of wood smoke and earth, a church bell echoing over the fields calling the devout to sermons that preached of sin and salvation, and against this backdrop a single man, ordinary and unremarkable, whispering of a woman's death who had not yet been born. It is the kind of detail that history prefers to bury, because if it is acknowledged it demands explanation, and explanations in this case fall apart. Was it delusion, was it coincidence, or was it something more disturbing, something that cracks the timeline of human understanding? The cold open of this story lingers here on the threshold between disbelief and terror. A man swears that he has seen the end of a life before the beginning has even arrived. The villagers turn their faces away, but their ears remember, and in that quiet unease the foundation of a greater mystery is set. For if death can be known before life, then what does it mean to live At all, the village itself should never have been a place of mystery nestled in a quiet valley where farmland met forest. It was the kind of community where life was measured by harvests, church bells, and the slow turning of seasons. Its houses built of weathered stone and timber leaned together as though whispering secrets only they could hear. Smoke curled steadily from chimneys. Hens wandered the dirt lanes, and in the distance the river moved with a patience older than memory. On the surface it was ordinary, yet within that ordinariness lived a strange fragility, a tension between the world the villagers knew and the shadows they still feared. The 19th century was a time of transition. Railroads, machines, and newspapers promised to modernize the countryside. Ideas of science and rational thought were spreading even to small towns, but in this village tucked far from the reach of progress, people still lived by the rhythm of older beliefs. Superstitions clung to doorframes and hearths. The sound of an owl at night was taken as an omen. A cracked mirror might mean a coming misfortune. Fields were blessed at planting, and children were marked with holy signs before they were sent to sleep. This was not a place where the extraordinary was welcomed. It was a place where survival depended on routine and predictability. To know what tomorrow would bring was the only comfort people had, and so when a man began speaking of visions that reached beyond tomorrow, visions that touched futures not yet live at, it was not just strange, it was dangerous. The man himself was a product of this soil. His family had worked the land for generations, their names carved into the parish rolls beside baptisms and marriages. He was not known as a troublemaker nor as a scholar. He had no reputation for wandering tales or idle invention. This made his words all the more unsettling. If he had been a drunkard, the villagers might have dismissed his claims as the nonsense of a weak mind. If he had been a storyteller, they might have laughed, but he was neither. He was one of them, and when one of their own spoke of impossible things, the village was forced to listen, even as it pretended not to. The whispers of his vision spread along the lanes in hesitant voices. At first the tale was shared with amusement. Farmers chuckled that he must have dreamt too deeply. Women at the well shook their heads, calling it a fancy that would fade. Children, overhearing repeated fragments in play, imagining the unnamed woman who might one day die. Yet beneath the laughter an unease took root, because details of his words, so precise, so strangely unwavering, did not slip easily from memory. The atmosphere of the village shifted in ways too subtle to measure. A family walking home from evening prayers would glance at their daughters with new fear. A mother waking to the cry of her infant would pause, hearing in the child's sob the echo of something darker. Each time the man's vision was repeated, the village seemed to breathe more heavily, as though the weight of inevitability pressed on every door and every bed. The church stood at the center of the town, its steeple pointing toward salvation, but even within its walls the villagers could not escape the unease. Priests spoke of faith, of trust in God's order, yet faith, for all its promises, could not erase the possibility that one among them had glimpsed the future. It was a contradiction too sharp to ignore. If God held the keys to life and death, why would he allow an ordinary man to peer into them? The man himself withdrew further into the village's quiet corners. He did not seek to persuade or to lead. Instead he seemed to shrink, as though his visions were burdens he wished desperately to lay down, yet fate would not let him. His neighbors would still glance at him with suspicion, sometimes pity, sometimes fear. He became a mirror onto which they projected their dread. To understand the depth of the unease, one must understand the isolation of such communities. In towns so small, nothing was forgotten. Every misstep, every rumor, every whispered word was woven into the fabric of memory, and once woven it could not be undone. This was the atmosphere into which the man's visions were spoken, a place where silence carried as much power as speech, where the absence of explanation was more frightening than the presence of horror. The land itself seemed to reflect the tension. Winters were long and heavy, snow pressing against rooftops until doors froze shut. Summers brought droughts that cracked the earth, forcing families to their knees in prayer for rain. The natural world was already merciless enough to add to it the terror of a future death, foretold but unavoidable, was to suffocate the spirit of the town. Villagers began to avoid the man at the market. Eyes slid away from him at church pews near his family sat strangely empty. In fields and workshops conversations faltered when he approached. No one wished to accuse him outright, for there was no crime in his words, but no one wished to be too close either. He became a figure of unease, tolerated but not embraced, visible yet unseen, and yet his presence lingered at the edge of every thought. At night, when the wind pressed against the shutters, mothers held their children tighter, imagining the unnamed woman of his prophecy. Was she yet unborn? Was she already among them? Which cradle held the life that carried within it the shadow of premature death? The village should have been a place of peace. Its routines should have sheltered its people from thoughts too large, too strange to fit into their days, but instead The prophecy hung over it like a storm that never broke, a silence that never lifted. The ordinary rhythms of life continued, plowing fields, baking bread, ringing bells, but beneath them was a current of dread that could not be named aloud. This was the soil in which the mystery would take root, a community bound by tradition, clinging to the comfort of repetition, suddenly confronted with a man whose words fractured time itself. He had described the death of someone who did not yet exist, and though the villagers denied it, though they tried to silence it with laughter or prayer, they could not unhear what had been said. And in that quiet valley where life should have unfolded with predictable ease, the first tremors of the impossible began to spread. There are moments in history when unease begins not with a thunderclap but with a whisper. In the village the whisper came as dreams. The man who had spoken of the unborn death began to murmur of visions that arrived in the night, dreams that left him sweating and restless. He claimed they were not dreams at all but something heavier, as though the future itself pressed down upon him while he slept. At first those closest to him brushed it aside. Everyone, dreams after all, nightmares of storm, of shadow, of sorrow are nothing new. But the man's words were different. He did not speak of vague feelings or nameless fears. He spoke of detail, small piercing detail, of faces he had never seen, of gestures too ordinary to be inventions. He described a woman brushing ash from her apron, a child with a crooked tooth, a stranger holding a red ribbon against the wind. None of these people existed in the village, and yet his descriptions carried a precision that unnerved even those who wished to dismiss him. When he told these dreams to neighbors, they laughed nervously. "You've seen too much smoke by the fire," one said. Another teased him that perhaps his mind was slipping with age. But even as they mocked, they remembered. The unease lingered after the laughter because his words did not fade with the telling. He repeated them again and again, always the same, as though etched in stone. Then came the first detail that silenced the laughter. One morning over bread and weak ale the man described a family he had never met. He spoke of their arrival as though it had already happened: a father with a limp, a mother with light hair, a child carried in her arms crying. He insisted that they would come to the village soon, strangers who would settle on the outskirts near the line of the forest. The villagers shook their heads. No such family lived there, and no one was expected. His words were dismissed as another fantasy, a dream too vivid to take seriously. But weeks later the family appeared just as he had said, the father dragging a lame leg behind him, the mother pale-haired carrying a child whose sobs echoed down the lane. They rented a cottage near the forest, exactly where the man had claimed they would. Suddenly his dreams no longer seemed harmless, they seemed prophetic. The story spread quickly, carried in hushed voices. Some claimed coincidence, others whispered of witchcraft, of a curse that allowed him to see what should be hidden. But the fact could not be ignored. He had spoken truth before truth had arrived. From that moment the villagers listened more carefully. Each new dream he spoke of was remembered, Wade feared. He described an infant not yet born who would come into the world with a distinct birthmark, a circle of pale skin on the shoulder. Weeks later a child was delivered to a young couple in the village, bearing the exact mark he had foretold. Mothers began to shiver when they heard his words. Fathers clenched their fists in private anger that such knowledge seemed to seep into their lives unbidden. Still there remained one vision above all others, one that returned to him again and again: the death of the woman who did not yet exist. In his restless sleep she appeared. Her face was clear to him, her movements were ordinary, even tender. And then came her end, sudden, tragic, absolute. He would wake gasping, his hands trembling, unable to push away the image. Each time he retold it his description remained the same: the flicker of candlelight, the torn hem of her dress, the silence that fell in the moment of her collapse. It was not simply a nightmare, it was a fixed certainty that haunted him. As this vision spread through the community, a strange contradiction took hold. People wanted to dismiss it, to call it madness, to laugh it away, yet in the secrecy of their homes they whispered about it. Mothers held their daughters closer, couples newly married looked at each other with unease, wondering if the unborn death might one day belong to their child. The prophecy was ridiculed in public but feared in private, and the tension between those two reactions grew sharper with each passing month. There were those who began to avoid him altogether. To hear his voice was to risk being burdened with knowledge one did not want. Others perversely sought him out. They pressed him with questions: would their crops fail? Would their children grow healthy? Would war touch the village? But he refused to answer such demands. He insisted that he did not control what came to him. The visions chose him, he could only repeat what he saw. This refusal only deepened the mystery. Was he cursed? Was he chosen? Or was he simply a man unraveling before their eyes, dragging the whole village into his unraveling? Children began to chant his words in games, making rhymes of the unborn death, turning fear into mockery. Yet even in play there was something chilling. The prophecy of the unnamed woman seeped into the bones of the village like damp into stone, impossible to scrub out. It is easy to imagine the man himself in these years, restless, gaunt, avoiding the eyes of his neighbors, a tradesman by necessity, a prophet by curse. He seemed to grow older before his time. His hands shook, his nights were long, his dreams, once a private torment, had become a communal wound, and through it all the vision of the unborn death remained constant, looming Like a shadow that stretched across the years, the villagers tried to explain it away. Perhaps he had heard of the traveling family before they arrived, perhaps the birthmark was a coincidence, perhaps yet each attempt at reason failed to quiet the unease. Coincidence, after all, does not repeat itself so often, so precisely, with such unnerving detail. The early signs, the anomalies, the dreams, these were the echoes before birth, echoes that did not belong to the present but to some other place, some other time, bleeding into their own. And though the villagers would never admit it openly, many of them felt the same thought pressing at the edges of their minds. If the visions that had already come true were undeniable, then the death he foresaw was not merely possible, it was inevitable. The echo of the unborn death had begun. Whispers are fragile things. They begin as fragments carried between friends, muttered at the edge of a table, half believed, half dismissed. But when whispers refuse to die, when they circle back again and again with the stubbornness of truth, they transform into something heavier. They become memory, they become testimony. The man's visions, first heard with unease, slowly gained witnesses who could no longer deny what they had seen and heard. His words had been dismissed as madness, yet reality began to fold itself around them in ways that no villager could ignore. And when the impossible touches not one man but many, the line between delusion and truth grows dangerously thin. It began with a neighbor. A farmer, weary from a season of poor harvest, recalled a strange conversation he had shared months before. The man had described to him the arrival of strangers who would take up residence near the forest's edge. At the time the farmer had laughed. No such family was expected, but then the family came, father, mother and child, just as foretold. Now the farmer found himself haunted. He had been told of it before it happened. He had witnessed the vision take flesh. Another villager, a woman who kept chickens near the river, recalled a different detail. The man had once spoken of an infant with a birthmark, a pale circle on the shoulder. She had thought little of it then, but when the child was born into the village weeks later, she saw the mark herself. As the babe was lifted from the cradle, she swore that her heart froze in her chest, for it was exactly as described. Piece by piece the man's strange burden began to find echoes in others. Not only was he speaking of futures, others were now confirming that these futures had come to pass. The villagers had become participants in his visions, unwilling witnesses to the impossible. Yet it was the death, always the death that lingered like a poison. He spoke of it in quiet repetition, describing the woman not yet alive, recounting the candlelight, the torn dress, the silence. This was the vision that unsettled even those who tried to defend him. It was not a prophecy of arrival or birth, it was a prophecy of tragedy, and it clung to the imagination with terrible insistence. Children began to whisper of the unborn woman during their games, inventing faces and stories, daring each other to guess which family might one day bring her into the world. Mothers grew cold at the mention, scolding their children into silence. Fathers avoided the subject altogether, though their silence betrayed a fear they would not voice. And so the man's words became something larger than himself. He was no longer simply a tradesman with troubled dreams, he became a symbol of dread, his visions woven into the fabric of the town. The witnesses gave his words shape, and in doing so they gave them power. Not all were convinced, of course. Skeptics remained. Some claimed the witnesses were exaggerating, reshaping memory to fit the story. Others suggested that villagers were eager to believe, eager to transform coincidences into proof. But even the skeptics felt the tension in the air. For every denial there was a counter voice insisting they had seen too much to dismiss. One evening in the tavern at the center of town the matter was spoken of openly. Farmers, laborers and tradesmen gathered in the warmth of ale and firelight, their voices low, their eyes darting toward the door. The farmer, who had heard of the arriving family, spoke up, his face pale. The woman with the chickens nodded, recalling the birthmark. A third villager claimed that the man had once predicted a storm weeks before it came, describing the pattern of the clouds, the ruined fields that followed. The room fell into an uneasy silence, each story layered upon the next, and together they painted a picture that no one wished to believe, but no one could quite escape. And still at the center of it all was the unborn death. The man himself seemed to grow more withdrawn. He did not seek to convince others, he did not press them with his visions. Instead he appeared burdened by their weight, reluctant to share, reluctant even to speak. When pressed he would shake his head, his eyes distant as though seeing something that no one else could see. Those who heard him swore that his silence was more frightening than his words. As the witnesses grew, so too did the tension within the village. The church, already wary, warned against giving the visions weight. The devil, one priest declared, works in counterfeit, he mimics truth to lead astray. But outside the church walls, in kitchens and barns, the villagers whispered all the more. Some argued that if the visions came from God they were a warning to be heeded. Others feared they were a curse, and that to acknowledge them was to invite ruin. What united them all, believer and skeptic alike, was fear that something had entered their lives which could not be explained, something that bent time, something that placed them all under the shadow of inevitability. As months passed the man's reputation grew beyond the village. Travelers, hearing fragments of the tale, arrived eager to listen. Some scoffed, dismissing it as peasant superstition, others lingered unsettled by the calm detail with which the man spoke. A few wrote down what they heard, carrying the whispers to towns beyond the story. Once a private wound began to seep into the world outside, the witnesses too carried it forward, for once a person is touched by the impossible they cannot easily let it go. They recalled his words at night, replayed them in silence, repeated them to others in private moments. Each retelling gave the vision another life, another echo, until it was no longer one man's burden but a collective haunting. It was this moment when the private became public, when the solitary became communal, that the mystery deepened. No longer could the villagers dismiss the man as a mad soul mumbling in the dark. Too many had seen too much, too many had confirmed what should not be confirmed. The witnesses had become part of the prophecy, and in doing so they had made it real. The impossible had been seen, and once seen it could not be unseen. When a community trembles it turns instinctively toward its church. In the village the stone chapel had stood for centuries, its bell tolling over baptisms, weddings and funerals. It was the keeper of rhythm, the anchor of life. Its walls had absorbed countless prayers, its altar had witnessed every secret hope and fear. Yet when whispers of the unborn death grew louder, the church became less a sanctuary and more a stage for tension that no prayer could resolve. The priests were not blind to the unease. They had heard the murmurs carried into confessionals. They had noticed pews filled with restless glances, with parishioners who listened to scripture but thought of prophecy. The villagers looked toward the pulpit for answers, yet the answers did not come. Instead the clergy met the mystery with silence. At first their restraint was deliberate. To acknowledge the man's visions they believed would give them power. Better to smother the whispers than to speak them aloud. In sermons priests redoubled their warnings about temptation, about false prophets, about the snares of the devil. They spoke of Job's trials, of Eve's weakness in the garden, of the dangers of listening to voices that promised knowledge meant only for God. But though the priests preached of scripture, the villagers heard only the echo of what was unsaid. Each warning seemed aimed directly at the man who claimed to see beyond the present. Each parable carried a shadow shaped like him. The villagers noticed the silences most of all when pressed in private. Priests would change the subject when confronted with direct questions. Could it be true? Could God allow one among us to see what has not yet happened? They gave no answer. Their faces betrayed unease, though their lips remained sealed. The silence was itself a confession. They did not know, and uncertainty from the pulpit was more frightening than prophecy from a tradesman behind closed doors. However, the church wrestled with its own dread. Letters survive, written in careful Latin, exchanged between priests of nearby parishes. They reveal a current of fear that the man's visions were not mere madness but something more troubling. Some priests believed it was a demonic deception. Others wondered in hushed speculation if God had permitted a glimpse of fate to test the faithful. None agreed, and so none dared to speak openly. Instead the church leaned into ritual. Sermons grew longer, prayers more urgent. The liturgy was performed with greater gravity, as though precision itself might ward away the unease. Parishioners were encouraged to confess more often, to fast, to keep their children close. But no matter how fervent the rituals, the visions continued, and the villagers carried them in their hearts like smoldering coals. One story survives of a Sunday morning when the man himself attended Mass. He entered quietly, sitting near the back, but the air shifted as soon as he crossed the threshold. Parishioners stiffened, eyes darting. Mothers clutched their children closer. Even the priest at the altar faltered, his voice quivering as he read the gospel. The man kept his eyes down, but his presence alone seemed to fill the room with tension. It was as if his silence screamed louder than any sermon. By the time the final hymn ended, half the congregation had fled the pews, unwilling to remain near him. The church never named him, never condemned him from the pulpit, but their avoidance was louder than accusation. He became a ghost in the very place meant to offer solace. He walked among them, unshunned by law yet quietly exiled by ritual. His soul was left to wander outside the boundaries of grace. This silence did not calm the villagers, it deepened their fear. For if the church, the one authority meant to separate truth from falsehood, refused to speak clearly, then what were they to believe? If priests feared to name the visions, did that not suggest they were too dangerous, too real to confront? In kitchens and barns this silence was dissected. A mother whispered that the priest had paled when asked of the unborn woman. A farmer insisted he had seen the parish deacon praying alone at midnight, tears streaming down his face. Children carried rumors that even the bishop had been warned of the visions but refused to intervene. Whether these stories were true or not, they spread, feeding the idea that the clergy knew more than they dared to reveal. For the man himself the silence became its own punishment. His words, already a burden, now carried the weight of condemnation. Without trial the villagers' unease, the priest's avoidance, the rituals performed with unusual fervor absorbed them all. He began to retreat Further speaking, less avoiding the market, lingering in the shadows of his own home, he seemed to understand that his very existence had become a kind of blasphemy, and yet even in his silence the visions did not stop. He still saw them, he still dreamt, he still woke trembling in the night, muttering of what was to come. The unborn death returned again and again, its details fixed, its inevitability pressing closer. He could no more silence the vision than he could silence the beating of his own heart. The Chich's silence grew heavier with each passing season. By avoiding the prophecy they had not erased it, they had sanctified it. What is forbidden becomes more alluring, what is unspoken becomes more powerful. The man's words, carried in whispers, now seemed untouchable by earthly authority. They belonged to a realm beyond sermons, beyond rituals, they belonged to fate. It is said that one priest near the end of his life broke the silence privately to a trusted friend. He confessed that he had long feared the man's visions were true. I prayed, he wrote, that they were the work of madness, but in my soul I feared they were not. For what man invents the death of one not yet alive and speaks it without change year after year? His words, though hidden, reveal the struggle that none dared to voice aloud. The silence of the church became the silence of the village. No one spoke openly of the prophecy anymore, but all carried it within them. They prayed louder, laughed harder, worked longer, as though by filling their lives with noise they might drown out the echo. But the echo remained, and in that silence, in that space where faith faltered and fear grew, the prophecy of the unborn death continued to spread. Time is meant to move forward with certainty. Days follow nights, seasons turn, lives begin and end. The calendar marks its rhythm, steady as the ticking of a clock. But in this village, under the weight of the unborn prophecy, that certainty began to crack. What the man described did not belong to the order of time. It bent the familiar sequence of life and death, as though fate had slipped from its track and veered into forbidden territory. The villagers began to notice small distortions in how they experienced their days. It began with simple unease. Farmers claimed that the sun seemed to linger too long at dusk, as if unwilling to surrender the sky to night. Mothers swore their children grew restless during hours that should have been quiet, as though the rhythm of the household no longer matched the natural clock. Even the bell of the chapel, which had told the same for generations, seemed to carry a different tone, hollow, uncertain, echoing more sharply than before. At first these were dismissed as superstitions, the natural consequence of fear, but the stories multiplied. A shepherd recounted that his flock had wandered into a field hours earlier than usual, as though they sensed dawn before it came. A midwife spoke of a woman who bled at the time of conception, a sign she swore was against the natural order. Each tale was strange enough to unsettle, yet too small to prove. They formed a chain of tiny anomalies that hinted at something larger. The man himself described the distortion of time in ways that chilled those who listened. He spoke of nights where he dreamt of events he knew had not yet occurred, faces he had never seen, objects that did not exist in the village. He would awaken certain that the dream had happened not as a vision but as a memory. It is as though I remember tomorrow, he told a confidant, as though it has already passed and I am doomed to live it again. Such words unsettled even the bravest souls, for to remember tomorrow is to strip life of choice, to turn every act into repetition. It was not just a prophecy, it was the collapse of freedom itself. As the seasons turned, villagers began marking their calendars differently. Some families scratched notches into wooden beams as though testing whether days still followed an order. Others relied on the moon, watching its phases more carefully than ever before, when even these cycles seemed unsettled. Clouded nights obscuring the moon, storms arriving off pattern. Fear deepened. Perhaps time itself had shifted. Perhaps they lived not in a world of progress but in a circle drawn tighter with each passing month, spiraling toward the unborn death foretold. The priests, still silent on the matter, could not halt this creeping sense of distortion in their refusal. Villagers began to turn to older traditions, folk practices passed down in whispers. They burned herbs at thresholds to steady the hours. They carried charms meant to bind the days. One old woman claimed she could feel the future pressing against the present like cloth stretched too thin. She warned that when fabric tears, the hole does not close again. The man at the center of it all grew gaunt, as though time itself consumed him. First neighbors swore he aged more quickly than others, that his hair thinned, his skin sagged, his eyes hollowed in ways that did not match his years. He appeared like a figure dragged forward too fast already, bearing the weight of a future no one else had yet lived. One testimony survives in the record of a traveling merchant. He wrote of passing through the village and meeting the man in question. He described a conversation by firelight during which the man spoke of the unborn woman's death in chilling detail. The merchant noted he spoke of her as though she had already been buried. His words carried the weight of memory, not of prediction. It was as if he had lived her funeral, though she has not yet been born. I left the village unsettled, certain that I had met a man displaced from time. This sense of displacement spread. People began to question not only the future but their own memories. Was a detail of yesterday truly as they recalled, or had it shifted? Had a word been spoken differently? Had a door been closed when it should have been opened? Doubt entered every recollection. A neighbor swore he had once seen the unborn woman's name carved into A family Bible, though upon returning the page was blank. Another claimed he had heard a lullaby sung in the night. A lullaby meant for a child who did not yet exist. Such stories blurred the boundaries between what was and what would be. The line between memory and vision grew fragile. If the unborn woman's death was already known, then in some sense it had already happened, and if it had already happened, perhaps time was not linear but fractured, its shards pressing into the present with painful inevitability. Scholars who later studied the case argued about this fracture. Some proposed psychological contagion, the spread of suggestion shaping perception. Others wondered if the man had suffered from a disorder of memory, confusing his dreams with lived experience. But even the most rational explanation stumbled when confronted with the villagers' collective experience. It was not one man who felt time bend, it was dozens, perhaps hundreds, who reported the strange shifts, the dissonance of hours, the unease of days, and through it all the unborn prophecy held its ground unchanging. The details never altered, as though they were carved into the stone of destiny. That constancy itself made the sense of distortion more haunting, for everything else might wobble: the sun's warmth, the rhythm of bells, the certainty of memory, but the prophecy stood fixed. It was the axis around which time bent, the unmovable point drawing the village into its orbit. By the end of that year, villagers no longer asked whether the unborn death would occur. They began to ask when their lives adjusted around the inevitability. Weddings were planned with hesitation, children born with fear. Why bring life into a world where the future had already been stolen? Why labor in fields when time itself seemed poisoned? The timeline had bent, and with it so too had hope. When the story of the unborn death escaped the boundaries of the village, it drew the attention of outsiders, scribes, clerics, physicians, and philosophers who thrived on mystery. For them this tale was not just a provincial superstition but a puzzle that demanded intellectual conquest. They came with quills and parchment, with books of scripture, and with instruments of reason, determined to explain what the villagers could only endure. The first explanations were theological. Church scholars suggested that the man's prophecy might be a form of divine revelation, a gift bestowed to warn the faithful. They argued that if God could know every hair on a man's head, then he could surely reveal the fate of one not yet born. Yet this explanation faltered under its own weight. If the vision came from God, why was it so grim? Why foretell death before life had even begun? Revelation was meant to guide, to strengthen faith, yet this one sowed despair. Some suspected darker origins, whispering that the vision was not heavenly but infernal, a trick meant to unravel the souls of believers. Others sought explanations in the body and the mind. Physicians of the age, steeped in humoral theory, claimed the man suffered from a melancholy imbalance. Too much black bile, they said, could cloud judgment, producing visions of dread. They noted his sunken face, his restless nights, his mutterings about time. To them he was less a prophet than a patient, his condition the natural outcome of diseased humors. Yet this too fell short. For how could one man's sickness bend the perception of an entire village? The physicians had no answer for why others, healthy and strong, began to share his unease. Philosophers took their turn. A few argued that the man had stumbled upon what they called the eternal recurrence, that time was not linear but circular, destined to repeat its events endlessly. If this were true, then perhaps he had glimpsed a cycle from a prior age, recalling not the future but the past reborn. Others countered with notions of parallel worlds, realms where unborn souls already walked their fates, echoing across unseen boundaries. To them the man had glimpsed across a veil, touching a reality adjacent to our own. Not all explanations were so lofty. Some skeptics insisted it was nothing more than coincidence, stretched by fear. Perhaps the man had spoken vaguely at first and the villagers had filled in the details themselves. Human memory, they argued, was a fragile thing, prone to shaping itself around stories. What began as a shadow of a tale grew sharper each time it was retold, until it seemed as though the prophecy had been precise from the start. Yet this rational account faltered when confronted with the merchant's written testimony or with the villagers who independently repeated the same details. Could coincidence account for such precision? One of the most unsettling theories came from an astronomer who visited the region in secret. He spoke of time not as a constant but as a field woven like threads across the heavens. If a thread frayed or snapped, he warned events might bleed through from future to present. The prophecy of the unborn death, he suggested, was not a vision but a leak in the fabric of reality, a fracture that allowed tomorrow to drip into today. His words frightened even those inclined toward reason, for if true it meant the universe itself could no longer be trusted. Despite the varied explanations, none could ease the villagers' burden. Each theory, whether divine, medical, or philosophical, left them with the same haunting certainty: the prophecy still stood unbroken. The unborn woman's death lingered like a storm cloud on the horizon, unaffected by human reasoning. The man himself listened to these learned voices with a mixture of weariness and despair. He had not sought their attention nor their interpretations. Their visits left him more troubled, for they treated his burden as curiosity, an experiment to be prodded and measured. He longed not for theories but for release, yet no one could offer it. The priests demanded silence, the physicians demanded treatment, the philosophers demanded explanations, but none could take from him the knowledge he carried. Villagers grew wary of the scholars, resenting how they dissected the prophecy like a specimen for the locals. This was no abstract riddle but a wound in the fabric of their lives. While the outsiders scribbled notes and debated, the villagers continued to feel the weight of hours bending, of seasons shifting. Their fear was lived, not studied. They began to withdraw from the visitors, treating them as intruders who failed to grasp the true horror. Still the theories traveled. They found their way into manuscripts, whispered into university halls, carried across borders by traders and priests. The tale of the unborn death became a case study, cited in arguments about fate and free will, about divine providence and human madness. Even as distance dulled the immediacy of fear, the story refused to vanish. It became a thorn in the side of scholars, a problem without resolution. Some centuries later, modern thinkers would revisit these accounts. Psychologists would label it a mass psychogenic event where fear spread contagiously, shaping perception. On a grand scale, physicists would muse about nonlinear time, invoking theories of relativity and quantum uncertainty. Folklorists would classify it as a death omen legend, pointing to similar tales scattered across cultures. Yet none of these later interpretations could erase the core truth. In that village at that time, a man spoke of the death of someone who had not yet been born, and the villagers believed him. Perhaps that is why the story endures. Explanations shift with the centuries, each reflecting the knowledge of its age, but the prophecy itself remains unmoved, a dark stone that no tide of reason can wash away. Learned men came with pens, with prayers, with instruments of thought. They left with theories, but the villagers were left with silence, waiting still for the moment when the prophecy would step from word into flesh. And so the unborn death lingered, suspended between knowledge and mystery, a case study for scholars, a nightmare for the villagers, and a reminder to all who hear it. Some questions are not meant to be solved, some are meant to haunt. The theories of the learned men left the village restless, not reassured. They had hoped for answers, but all they received were conflicting interpretations, none strong enough to drive away the shadow that had taken root. It was in this void between explanation and silence that despair began to spread like a plague. At first it was subtle, a hesitation in the way villagers spoke of tomorrow, a reluctance to plant seeds for the next season, a heaviness in the eyes of mothers when they looked at their daughters, wondering if the prophecy pointed to them, if death was already waiting. These were quiet changes, but they deepened day by day until they became impossible to ignore. The man at the center of it all, the one who had spoken the impossible words, was now more isolated than ever. Villagers avoided him in public, fearful that even his shadow might contaminate their lives. Yet in secret some sought him out, desperate to know if he had seen more. Did he know the exact face of the unborn woman? Did he know the hour when life and death would collide? Most left his home disappointed, for he had no more visions to share. He spoke only of the same certainty, repeating it as though bound by chains, a death that belonged to someone who had not yet been born. His repetition was like a bell tolling endlessly, each ring more unbearable than the last. Whispers grew that the village was cursed. Families began tracing their genealogies, desperate to discover whether they were linked to the unborn woman. The effort fractured relationships. Cousins accused cousins, husbands suspected wives. Every birth was greeted not with joy but dread. New mothers wrapped their infants tightly, clutching them as though fate might steal them away. Children grew up in the shadow of an expectation they could not understand. Even their laughter sounded strained, as if guilt had already touched their innocence. Economic life faltered. Farmers hesitated to trade with outsiders, worried that news of the prophecy would mark their goods as cursed. Merchants avoided the market, claiming the air itself carried an ill omen. The once busy square fell into silence, its stalls abandoned, its cobblestones echoing only with the footsteps of the fearful. Hunger crept in when bellies tightened, tempers grew short, petty disputes turned to fights, and neighbors who had once shared bread now turned their backs on one another. The church tried to hold the community together, but even faith fractured under the weight of the prophecy. The priest, once confident in scripture, found his sermons faltering. He urged his flock to trust in God's mercy, yet the congregation looked upon him with hollow eyes. Their faith had been shaken not by an enemy or a disaster but by a single sentence. The priest himself confessed in private moments that he felt abandoned. He prayed for guidance, but heaven seemed silent. The silence was more terrifying than the prophecy itself. There were attempts at resistance. A few men declared the prophecy nonsense, insisting life must go on. They urged others to ignore it, to till the fields to rebuild, the market to marry and raise families as before, yet their voices were drowned by the weight of despair when one of these men fell ill and died suddenly. Whispers claimed it was punishment for defiance. Reason had no defense against coincidence when fear ruled every thought. The men who had spoken bravely soon joined the silence, afraid to be the next example. Superstition filled the void, protective charms appeared on doors and windows. Families marked their thresholds with strange symbols hoping to ward off the prophecy. Women wore amulets around their necks, whispering old incantations while rocking their babies to sleep. The village transformed into a place of ritual and fear, where every creak of wood or flutter of wind was read as an omen. The prophecy had become a living thing, feeding on belief, growing stronger with each whispered prayer and each fearful glance. The man himself grew weaker, his health declined as though the prophecy consumed him from within. His voice lost its strength, his body grew thin, yet he continued to repeat the words when asked. Some believed his decline was proof of possession, others that it was the price of carrying knowledge not meant for mortals. His presence became unbearable. A few villagers argued that he should be banished, that removing him might remove the curse, but others feared that to drive him away would anger fate further, and so he remained a figure both shunned and sought, a prisoner within his own village. Seasons turned, but time itself felt poisoned. Winters seemed harsher, summers less generous. Even when harvests came, they tasted bitter, as though fate had salted the soil. Children who grew older felt marked by the prophecy, as though they carried a shadow upon their shoulders. Some left the village seeking refuge elsewhere, but most stayed, bound by land, by family, by fear. Those who left were never spoken of again, as if the village had cut them from memory to protect itself. The collapse was not sudden but gradual, like the slow crumbling of a stone wall. One by one supports gave way, trust between families, faith in God, confidence in the turning of the seasons. All fell until the village stood hollow, a shell of its former self. By the time outsiders returned, the community was unrecognizable. Homes stood abandoned, streets were empty, and those who remained moved like shadows, their voices hushed, their eyes cast downward. Hope, once the invisible thread that bound the village together, had unraveled completely. In its place remained only endurance, a grim persistence, a waiting without expectation of reprieve. The prophecy had not yet come true, but its promise of death had already fulfilled itself in another way. It had killed joy, killed trust, killed the future before the unborn woman had even drawn her first breath. And still the villagers waited, each day a repetition of the last, each hour a step closer to a moment they both dreaded and anticipated, for in some twisted way, the eventual fulfillment of the prophecy seemed preferable to the endless waiting. Death, when it finally came, would at least close the wound. Until then they remained trapped in the collapse of hope, prisoners of a fate written before its subject had even existed. When the collapse had finally run its course, what remained was not chaos but stillness. The village, once vibrant with the ordinary noise of life, now moved in whispers and hesitant steps. There were no more debates, no more desperate gatherings to argue over theories, only silence, the kind of silence that settles over a battlefield after the last cry has faded. The prophecy still hung over them unfulfilled, but it no longer needed to scream. Its power had already sunk into every corner of the community. Families spoke in half-sentences, afraid that naming the fear too clearly might summon it closer. Doors were closed earlier in the evenings, windows stayed shuttered even on clear days, as though to shut out the gaze of something unseen. The man who had spoken the words was rarely seen, his health already failing kept him indoors. Some said he no longer wished to speak, that he had grown weary of repeating the prophecy that had consumed his life. Others whispered that he had been silenced by something greater, that his voice had been taken as payment for seeing too much. His absence was both a relief and a terror. Without him the prophecy lost its human face, but it also became more intangible, more ghostly, an idea untethered, roaming freely in the minds of all. In this silence memory itself began to erode. Children born after the first whisper of the prophecy did not remember a village of laughter and song. They grew up under the shadow of the curse, knowing no other life for them. Fear was ordinary, silence was natural. To ask questions was dangerous, for questions only led to the prophecy, and the prophecy led only to despair. Parents taught their children to endure, not to dream. In that way the silence reproduced itself across generations. The priest continued his duties though his congregation had dwindled. The church bell still rang, but its sound carried differently, echoing against emptier streets. Inside prayers were murmured with less conviction, more ritual than belief. The priest himself appeared older than his years, worn not by labor but by the weight of unanswered prayers. He preached of faith, yet his eyes betrayed his own silence, as though heaven too had turned its face from the village. Outsiders began to hear of the place. Rumors traveled along trade routes, stories of a village cursed by a Prophecy too strange to ignore, but when travelers arrived they found little to confirm the tale. No blood on the streets, no demons at the door, only the silence thick and unsettling. Some left quickly, unnerved by the heaviness in the air. Others stayed long enough to see how the silence had reshaped lives, how villagers avoided direct questions, how conversations dissolved into muttered half-truths. Outsiders carried these impressions away, retelling the strangeness, and the legend spread further. The village became known less for its history than for its quiet dread, yet beneath the silence small acts of resistance flickered. A few young villagers longed for escape. They dreamed of distant towns where the prophecy was nothing more than a rumor, where they might live without the shadow of an unborn death. Some managed to leave, slipping away under cover of night. Others were caught by fear before they could cross the boundary, turning back as though the air beyond the village might choke them. The silence was not only within the walls of homes, it lived in their very bones. Years passed, but time did not heal. If anything, it deepened the wound. The prophecy remained suspended, neither fulfilled nor forgotten, its weight pressing heavier with each season. When deaths occurred as they naturally did, the silence thickened around them. Every funeral was an event of quiet terror, each coffin a reminder that perhaps this was the death foretold. But when none matched the description of the unborn woman, the waiting resumed. The silence after each burial was louder than the service itself. The man who had spoken the prophecy eventually died. His passing was unmarked by ceremony, as though the villagers feared to honor him. His body was buried quickly, the grave left without inscription. Some believed his death might end the curse, that silence would finally give way to relief, but nothing changed. If anything, the silence grew heavier, now unbroken even by his frail voice. The prophecy lived on, divorced from the man who had given it shape. It was then that folklore began to weave around the silent. Stories whispered of women who walked at night, faces unseen, perhaps the unborn soul searching for her place. Others told of dreams in which a child appeared, speaking in riddles, promising to return one day. The silence had created fertile ground for myth, and in the absence of sound, imagination thrived. These stories were told not with the joy of legend but with the dread of inevitability. By now the village was less a community than a memory. Families thinned, houses fell to ruin, and fields grew wild. The silence had driven away not just joy but life itself. A few stubborn souls remained, unwilling or unable to leave. They lived like shadows, tending small gardens, keeping to themselves. When outsiders came they offered little hospitality, speaking in brief words that revealed nothing. The silence was all that remained of their heritage, the prophecy its unbroken spine. And so the silence after the collapse became the village's legacy. More powerful than famine, more enduring than plague, it held the people captive in a grip more binding than chains. It was a silence that did not merely exist between words but inside them, corrupting meaning, hollowing out truth. It was the silence of resignation, the silence of lives lived under an endless shadow. Centuries later, when the ruins of the village were rediscovered, travelers noted the strange quiet that still seemed to linger among the stones. Birds avoided nesting there, and the wind carried a muted tone. As if hushed by unseen lips, they wrote of the silence as something palpable, a relic as enduring as any building. The prophecy had not been recorded in stone, yet it remained alive in the silence itself, echoing down the years. The silence after was not an ending, it was a transformation, the prophecy turning from words into atmosphere, from a single man's voice into the very soul of a place. And even now those who pass through say the silence waits. It waits for the death of someone who has not yet been born. As centuries passed, the story of the unborn death did not fade. Scholars, historians and folklorists returned to the village's legacy, each seeking to impose order on chaos, to explain what had defied reason for generations. The final theories, though varied, shared a common thread. They acknowledged that the events, however interpreted, had left an indelible mark on those who had lived through them. Some historians emphasized context. They argued that fear alone had produced the prophecy's power in times of hardship, disease, famine, political unrest. Villages often created narratives to account for uncertainty. The unborn death, they suggested, was a manifestation of collective anxiety crystallized in the voice of a single man whose words were amplified by panic. These theorists pointed to similar cases across Europe and Asia where foreboding predictions shaped communities' behaviors long before events had any possibility of occurring. From this perspective, the prophecy was less supernatural than psychological, a study in the human mind's ability to manufacture certainty from fear. Yet psychological explanations left gaps: the precision of the man's words, the consistency across independent witnesses, and the long endurance of the story suggested something more. For some, the prophecy could not be reduced to hysteria alone. Could a single individual in a small isolated community articulate with such detail a death that had not yet occurred? This question haunted researchers, compelling some to turn toward metaphysics to explore realms where time and causality might bend. One of the most discussed final theories drew on the concept of nonlinear time inspired by advances in physics and philosophy. Theorists proposed that past, present and future might not follow a straight line. Perhaps events we call future already exist in some form parallel to our own, waiting to intersect with consciousness. The man under this lens was not merely a prophet but a conduit, his mind sensitive to the vibrations of a reality where destiny and memory overlapped. He glimpsed what was already written, and in speaking it aloud he reshaped perception itself. Others embraced a more spiritual explanation. The prophecy they suggested might be an echo of a soul not yet born, a voice reaching across time to warn the living. In this view, the unborn woman was not simply an object of fate but an agent, her future self attempting to assert presence in a world not yet ready. The villagers' fear and attention amplified her existence, giving shape to a possibility that might otherwise have remained invisible. Faith and superstition then were not the cause of terror but the medium through which it traveled. Folklorists offered yet another lens, situating the prophecy within a broader tapestry of myth and legend. Death omens, visions of unborn children and predictions of catastrophe appear repeatedly in human culture. They argued that stories like this emerge in isolated communities as a mechanism to teach caution, instill social cohesion, or externalize anxiety. The village's experience from this perspective was a vivid, tragic iteration of a universal human pattern, the creation of narrative to grapple with mortality and uncertainty. A minority of scholars, however, took the narrative at face value. They suggested that the unborn death might indeed have been real, that the man's vision represented knowledge beyond ordinary perception. In their view, dismissing it as superstition or psychology risked underestimating forces beyond comprehension. These scholars often framed the story as a cautionary tale, warning that human understanding is limited and that some truths, no matter how meticulously observed, cannot be explained or contained. Even with these diverse interpretations, consensus remained elusive. The event resisted classification, its endurance across time, the precision of the prophecy, and the overwhelming psychological impact on the village defied a single narrative. It remained a phenomenon that blurred the line between history and legend, reality and dream life, and the shadow of what had not yet existed. Modern commentators have revisited the village with tools that would astonish the villagers themselves. Anthropologists armed with audio and visual recording measure responses to memory and fear. Psychologists conduct cognitive tests to explore mass suggestion. Physicists and philosophers debate the implications of time as a flexible dimension. Yet even with these instruments, the story retains its uncanny edge. Machines can record, but they cannot feel the weight of anticipation, the dread that shaped generations, or the stillness that followed a prophecy of someone not yet born. Part of the fascination lies in the story's incompleteness. Unlike other historical mysteries, the unborn death does not have a resolution that can be neatly presented. There is no body to exhume, no final confession, no proof beyond the accounts preserved in parchment and memory. Each new interpretation only adds layers, expanding the mystery instead of closing it. The story thrives in this space between certainty and doubt, where human curiosity meets the unknowable. Some theorists have proposed a hybrid explanation combining psychology, folklore and metaphysics. Perhaps the man's visions were heightened by his own mental state, amplified by collective belief and filtered through a consciousness that perceived possibilities beyond ordinary experience. In this scenario, both rational and supernatural elements coexist. The prophecy is neither purely imagined nor strictly real. It exists in the interplay between human perception and the unseen structure of events, a bridge between the known and the unknowable. Ultimately, the final theories all converge on one truth: the story continues to resonate precisely because it cannot be fully explained. Scholars can debate methodology, cross-reference accounts and draw parallels with other cases, but the essence of the prophecy endures. It is a narrative that resists closure, a haunting that exists independently of the man who first spoke it and of the village that suffered beneath its shadow. In that sense, the unborn death belongs to anyone who encounters it. It is a lesson in patience and fear and the limits of knowledge. To study it is to confront the possibility that some phenomena cannot be reduced to language, science or reason. The prophecy is both a historical record and a mirror reflecting our own anxieties about time, life and the unseen forces that shape our existence. The final theories then do not provide comfort. They do not absolve the village, the man or the unborn woman. Instead, they offer perspective, frameworks through which we can examine a mystery that defies certainty. They remind us that human understanding is provisional and that the world in all its complexity may hold truths that are both visible and forever hidden. The story of the unborn death is in the end a testament to endurance, of memory, of fear, of legend, and like all enduring mysteries, it is defined not by the answers we possess but by the questions we continue to ask. The story of the unborn death did not end with the village's silence nor with the man's passing nor with the scholarly debates that followed. Instead it continued to resonate, carried forward in whispers and shadows and in the human imagination. Time had passed, generations had turned, yet the echo of that singular impossible prophecy lingered like a persistent chill, felt more than seen, experienced more than explained. Travelers who passed through the region centuries later described a peculiar weight in the air, a stillness that was more than mere quiet. The wind seemed reluctant to stir, the trees bowed under an invisible gravity, and the stones of the village paths appeared older not just in age but in memory, as though they bore witness to events that ordinary history could not contain. Some reported hearing distant footsteps, a soft voice murmuring a warning, though the village itself was abandoned. These were the eternal echoes of a prophecy that had already shaped lives long before it might have been fulfilled. Writers and chroniclers took note, weaving the story into books and essays, each attempting to preserve what they could, yet all acknowledging its resistance to finality. Every retelling carried a shadow of the original fear, a trace of the silence that had engulfed the villagers. In reading the accounts one could feel the oppressive weight of anticipation, the slow tightening of dread that had defined the community for decades. The unborn death had become more than an event, it was a presence, a persistent hum at the edge of consciousness. Even modern historians approach the story with caution. Archival evidence survives, but it is fragmentary, tantalizing. Incomplete diaries, letters and merchant logs provide glimpses but never a complete picture. This incompleteness is essential to the echo. What is missing, what can only be imagined, is as important as what is recorded. The silence and gaps become part of the narrative, allowing the mystery to persist in every retelling. Every reader or listener becomes complicit, filling the spaces with their own fear, curiosity and speculation. Psychologists studying mass memory and folklore cite the tale as a rare example of collective experience shaping perception across generations. The unborn death, they argue, illustrates the ways in which anticipation and narrative intertwine to create reality for a community, even those born decades later. Never having witnessed the original events, absorbed the legacy of fear in family stories, local customs and silent warnings. In this way the prophecy continued to influence human behavior long after the people who first lived it had vanished. Philosophers and theoretical physicists revisit the story in a different light, pondering questions of time, causality and consciousness. Could a single individual perceive events beyond the linear progression of time? Could the human mind act as a prism, bending the future into the present? These questions are not rhetorical, they reflect the enduring power of the narrative. The prophecy challenges assumptions about what is possible, leaving each generation of thinkers unsettled, intrigued and compelled to seek answers that may forever lie just beyond reach. In literature the village has become archetypal, its empty streets, its hushed inhabitants and the man who spoke of unborn death are symbols of the fragility of human understanding. Writers draw on the tension between knowledge and ignorance, presence and absence, life and anticipation. The village's story illustrates that some mysteries cannot be solved, they must be felt, lived and reflected upon. In this sense the unborn death transcends history and enters the realm of myth, where it can speak across centuries without ever diminishing in impact. Some modern travelers report experiencing a subtle unease when visiting the ruins. They describe moments of disorientation, glimpses of figures that vanish upon approach or sounds that seem human but are nowhere to be found. These experiences, while anecdotal, are consistent with the idea that the prophecy left an imprint on the landscape itself. The village, though abandoned, carries a resonance of the fear, the anticipation and the silence of generations. The echoes are eternal, embedded in air, stone and memory. Anthropologists note that the villagers' rituals, abandoned as the community declined, left subtle traces in surviving customs of nearby towns. Certain chants, protective marks and ways of marking time appear inexplicably passed down even when the original purpose had been forgotten. These vestiges serve as faint reminders of the prophecy's reach, a whisper of a story that refuses to die. The unborn death has thus transcended the confines of its original moment, echoing through culture and consciousness alike. Ultimately the eternal echoes remind us that some mysteries are larger than individual lives or communities. The prophecy is a mirror reflecting human fear, curiosity and the desire to understand what cannot be fully known. It is a meditation on time, mortality and the fragile boundaries of perception. Every telling, every reading, every study is a step into the same silence that once enveloped the village, a place where anticipation and dread are inseparable, where life and the specter of what has not yet come exist in uneasy coexistence. The story concludes not with resolution but with continuation. The unborn death may never manifest in a way that confirms or denies the prophecy, yet its impact endures. It lives in the minds of those who study it, in the Ruins that hold its memory, and in the persistent sense that time itself is not as simple as it seems. The echoes are eternal, a reminder that some truths are meant not to be captured but to resonate, shaping the imagination and the heart across generations. And so the prophecy of the unborn death persists, a timeless whisper carried by the wind, reflected in shadowed streets and alive in the minds of all who confront it. Its eternal echo reminds us that the line between life and expectation, between memory and possibility, is fragile, and that the human experience is forever haunted by the mysteries we cannot fully explain. The silence remains, the fear remains, the echoes remain, and somewhere beyond the reach of the known, the unborn death waits, a shadow in time, a question without answer, a story that will not end. Long after the village itself had vanished from maps, the story of the unborn death left an indelible mark on those who came after. The ruins, overgrown with ivy and moss, carried a peculiar aura, a tension that seemed almost physical. Travelers, scholars and adventurers reported a feeling of being watched, as though the past had somehow lingered, waiting to witness the living. The legacy of shadows had begun, not with the man or the prophecy itself but with the fear it instilled, a fear that refused to fade with the passing of time. Local communities nearby preserved fragments of the tale, passing it down in whispers, in cautionary sayings and in ritualized warnings. Children were told not to wander too far at night lest they encounter the unseen presence of someone whose life had been foretold but not yet begun. Elders spoke of it in hushed tones, careful to avoid drawing attention, yet ensuring the story remained alive. In this way the prophecy's influence endured, shaping behavior, belief and imagination across generations. Historians who examined the region centuries later found layers of memory embedded in local practices. Festivals once celebratory carried subtle elements of remembrance, masked as superstitions or folktales. Certain households maintained protective marks on thresholds, unchanged in form but detached from their original meaning. Anthropologists concluded that the prophecy's legacy was cultural as well as psychological, a living reminder of events that had shaped the village long before its physical decay. Writers and filmmakers, drawn by the uncanny persistence of the tale, reimagined the story in countless forms. Novels, short stories and films emphasized different aspects. Some focused on the man who spoke the prophecy, others on the village consumed by fear, and yet others on the unborn woman whose existence remained a mystery. Each adaptation preserved the core tension, the inevitability of fate and the fragility of human perception. The legacy of shadows became both a narrative device and a philosophical meditation on uncertainty, bridging the gap between history and myth. The scientific community also weighed in. Psychologists analyzed the effects of long-term fear on a small population, studying how anticipation could alter perception, memory and behavior. Physicists speculated about the intersections of consciousness and time, using the story as a case study for phenomena that defy conventional measurement. While no definitive conclusions emerged, the story's persistence prompted deeper investigation into the ways human minds engage with uncertainty, mortality and unseen forces. Even modern spiritual practitioners found resonance in the tale. Some interpreted the prophecy as a cautionary example of the thin boundary between life and the potential for influence beyond one's immediate perception. Rituals invoking ancestral memory or protective energies drew inspiration from the villagers' attempts to shield themselves from fate. These practices, while varied, echoed the original impulse of the community to survive, to endure and to wrest some measure of control from events beyond understanding. Despite centuries of reinterpretation, the unborn death remained an enigma. Each generation encountered the story anew, layering its own questions, fears and interpretations upon the existing framework. The original prophecy had never been fulfilled in the tangible sense, yet its influence remained unmistakable. Scholars and storytellers alike noted that the power of the narrative did not depend on a literal outcome but on the enduring presence of doubt, anticipation and collective consciousness. Visitors to the region often remarked on subtle anomalies, glimpses of movement in abandoned buildings, sudden chills that could not be explained by wind or temperature, and the occasional sensation of being observed. While skeptics dismissed these as psychological artifacts, believers argued that they were echoes of the prophecy itself, a lingering resonance that had become part of the environment. In this way, the shadows of the past persisted in the present, tangible enough to unsettle yet elusive enough to evade confirmation. The legacy of shadows ultimately was not confined to one place or time. The story traveled across borders, inspiring discussions of fate, mortality and the unseen threads that connect lives across generations. Philosophers used it as a lens to examine human consciousness and our desire for certainty. Writers employed it to explore the tension between knowledge and ignorance. Psychologists, historians and folklorists alike found in it a rare convergence of human experience, imagination and the unexplainable. The unborn death's shadow remains not as a singular event frozen in history, But as a living phenomenon echo that continues to shape thought behavior and storytelling, it is a reminder that some truths resist containment, that human perception is fragile, and that the past and future may be more intertwined than we dare to imagine. Those who study the tale feel its weight long after leaving the village or reading its records, carrying with them a subtle sense of unease, a recognition of the limits of understanding and the inescapable presence of something greater than themselves. And so the legacy endures. The village may be gone, the man long dead, and the unborn woman perhaps never known, but the prophecy remains alive in memory, in culture, and in imagination. Its shadow stretches across time, a cautionary echo of mortality, anticipation, and the delicate boundary between knowledge and mystery. The story has become immortal, carried forward not in physical records alone but in the minds of all who encounter it, a spectral presence that will not release its hold. The legacy of shadows teaches us that some mysteries are eternal, not because they must be solved but because they persist in the spaces between thought and experience. It reminds us that fear and hope, memory and expectation can shape reality itself, leaving traces long after events have ended. And in the hush of abandoned streets, in the stillness of ruined homes, and in the whispers that travel across time, the prophecy waits, patient, unwavering, eternal.